¿Alguien necesita interpretación?
Y estaba con Katy ya en esa pelea.
Sí, así, Carlos está por aquí.
Hay que poner más sillas.
¿Ven?
Pongo más sillas.
¿Cómo?
Más sillas.
Sí, creo que vamos a tratar de
¿Ah? ¿Que le baja el volumen? Bueno, son sus estudiantes.
¿Qué se hicieron?
Yo he estado en contacto ya touch with Michael for several months now about this combination of approaches, which is very interesting. Michael es profesor investigador de la Universidad del Oeste de Inglaterra y está en Costa Rica por una conferencia enfocado en el cuido. Y yo creo que cuando pensamos en cuido, pensamos más en la parte doméstica, pero también puede ser un lente a través del cual podemos ver temas como adaptación al cambio climático y seguridad hídrica. Entonces, muy interesante. Y Michael me dijo que él era uno de 2 o 3 hombres en la conferencia de 200 a 300 personas, que me parece súper interesante. Gracias por traerles a la universidad. So Michael is in Costa Rica this time. I was invited to speak at a conference on care, and we often think about care in more of a domestic sense. And Michael used that as a lens to look at water security, climate adaptation, and at this conference of 200 to 300 people, he was one of 2 or 3 men at the conference. So I thank him for bringing that diversity to thinking about care. Okay, entonces, muchas gracias, Michael, por estar aquí. Thank you, Michael, for being here. Nadie necesita traducción.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for that. It's amazing. I will speak in English, where I'm allowed in English. I am learning Spanish. It's been lovely to be here and be able to speak some of the Spanish that I know from years ago. It's been an amazing day to be here. So if anyone needs me to speak slower or to have a translation from somewhere, then just let me know. If you don't understand something, we can talk about it. I'm going to speak for I think about 40 minutes maximum. I'm going to try and make it 40 minutes, so then we can have a conversation after that. And I'd like to hear about your thoughts on what I present. And specifically, I was thinking I had 2 things I'd like to hear from you about. Maybe you can reflect on this while you listen to the presentation. One is, I'm here to learn about what's happening in Costa Rica. I would like to know your understanding and your experiences of climate change and environmental change. What's happening here? How have you experienced it? In which ways are you aware of it? And what's happening here in the environment where you live? So that's one thing I'd like to just simply to know more about as I'm here. And then secondly, I'd really like you to think about care in the relationship to the environment, and just think about that. What is the relationship between care and care practices and the environment? And I'll give some thoughts to what I think that is, but I'd really like to hear where you think care and care practices work in the environment. And I'll leave it at that. Maybe have a reflection on those 2 ideas. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about me, because I think it's important for me to express who I am to an audience that doesn't know me. And I'll do that quickly. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about theory and ideas about care and how I use the concept. And then I'm going to give you, I hope, 3 cases that I've explored in my research as part of my practice on looking at water, care, and climate change. And then I'll return with 1 slide to just summarize some of the care ideas. And then I'd like to open it for discussion after that. So this is the slide about me. So you can see my title is I'm a professor of collaborative community practice. So I made that up. I created that. It's not in a discipline. People always ask me. They've asked me today what's my disciplinary area, and it's not a discipline. It's a practice. It's a process. And it's informed by participatory action research and socially engaged arts practice. Those are maybe the 2 main areas of influence that tell me what to do. But what that means is I work in multiple environments with many different kinds of people, and I try to bring people together to explore challenges that they may face. I work in 2 main research areas. Today I'm talking about the first one, which is climate change and water. And that's an important area, obviously, for the entire globe. and I've worked specifically in 3 countries on that topic, which I'll highlight today. The second area of research also draws on the arts, and that's on arts and mental health and well-being. I'm not going to talk about this today, but this is also, it could be possibly an area of further development in terms of thinking about the impacts of climate change on displacement and the trauma people may feel as their communities change, and how do we use the arts and humanities to help people get through those or understand that change or manage the traumas that they may feel. So anyhow, those are 2 different research areas that I'm involved in. The key theme that I use across these, other than the process, is the concept of care. For me, the idea of care is central to all human life and our environment. And I use that idea to make sense of almost every aspect of the world and my research, and I try to think about the relations of people and their world through the lens of care. So that crosses both of those ideas. So some background on some of the projects in the climate change area that I work on. It's very important to know, and sort of why am I talking about climate change and water today? So you probably know all this, of course, but the key idea is climate change and environmental change, global warming, is working through the planet through the hydrological cycle, through clouds, through rain, through storms, through the oceans, and so on. So climate change is water-driven. It's changing our environment really through water. So if we want to understand climate change, it's the experiences of water, which are really fundamental to understanding that. Not only, but that is how it's being translated and across the world. Now, some water-related consequences of climate change we could expect are, and you may be aware of some of these and experience some of this, is increased severity and frequency of floods and droughts. So our floods are becoming more intense, and drought periods of drought are becoming more intense. We're seeing quite a lot of coastal erosion due to rising sea levels. So we see that, which is making people leave their homes and displacing people. We're also seeing through the climate change changes in water quality. So for example, as a coast erodes, salt water can infiltrate drinking water supplies, and that might change the quality of drinking water. So the drinking water qualities, landslides, and also from a flood may result in poor water quality as well. And of course, all of this may result in diminished or challenged or threatened water sources, which may lead to conflicts over water. And there's been a lot of talk about the potential water wars and this sort of thing. So there's this idea that that climate change is making our water environment more challenging and more risky. Okay, so this is one reason why I want to look at water. And it's interesting, the stories that I look at and the cases I look at are not in one area so I don't just simply look at the coast or floods, but I look at the climate change, and I'm interested in looking at the multiple ways it works through the environment, through water in different contexts, which will mean I look at a lot of different kinds of places. So to talk a little bit about care, this is for me one of the most important paragraphs written on care that allows me to use it in the way that I use it. And I'll just read the first bit of that sentence. Care is everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. So this is a very open idea about what care is. I mean, think about that. Care means repairing, maintaining, living in the world so we can flourish. So I think that this life-sustaining idea of care is so fundamental when we think about our relationship to the environment and how it cares for us and how we care for the environment, and that cycle and that reciprocity we talked about a little bit earlier is central to that. So this was not written necessarily with the idea of the environment involved when John Toronto wrote this, but it has been applied and opened up to many different ways of looking at care beyond just looking after ourselves or our neighbors or our children. So to explore a little bit more about this relationship between water and care, I want to talk about a few different aspects of that, about water and its relationship to care. Now, first of all, as we know, water is completely entangled in our lives. Our bodies are water. We can't live without water. There's water through and through. It is interdependent. We rely on it. and it is entangled in our lives completely. Water is essential to all of us. Without drinking water, there would be no civilizations and so on. So care also works its way through the infrastructures that allow us to access clean water. So, for example, I'd like to think about this. Maybe this is a well someone's accessing. These kinds of simple infrastructures, from the most simple to the most complicated, always require some kind of repair or maintenance, just everyday looking after, which is a care practice. So we are always applying some kind of element of care in the way we look after the infrastructures that provide us with different kinds of water. Could be very simple or complicated. And finally, this idea of care is another central idea to me. It recognizes that we are all fragile. So generally, the idea of fragility is used as a negative. If I said, oh, you're very fragile, that means that's a bad thing. That means I can just put you down. So you don't have any resilience, or you don't have any, make you weak or something. But I argue that we must recognize our inherent fragility. We all are fragile, and the environment is fragile. And if we recognize that and actually celebrate that, we can welcome care more openly and robustly into the practices of environmental protection or water security and other ways. Care is often, and the idea of fragility is often shunned in the idea of water security because it's seen as a weakness. But if we recognize that how fragile we really are, it becomes, we then open it up and see it in so many different places. The idea of fragility is really important to me as a positive, not as a negative. So just to highlight a few things in the cases, which I'll turn to in just a moment, a few kinds of things you might see, that what are the care practices around that. So I'm interested in the physical water resources. I'm interested in pipes and pumps and dams and materialities that allows us to have access to clean water or to protect us from a flood and all that sort of stuff. All that makes up a network that allows us to flourish. Without those things, we would not be able to survive. I'm interested in the practices of looking after those, so maintaining them. I always ask, whenever I see a traditional water tank, rainwater harvesting, I say, who looks after this? Who cleans the roof? How does that happen? Because those are care practices that someone usually is involved in, and most often those are community-oriented, volunteer actions of looking after yourselves and the wider community. And then finally, I'm really interested in how people are adapting. So all of this care practices is happening in a context of environmental change. So what does it mean now if we are threatened with longer periods of drought or more flooding? And how do our relations to maintain and adapt to those changing situations, how do they change? Those are things that I'm interested in. So that's the basic background theory and ideas and concepts that I work with whenever I go to a place and start looking at water security and the idea around environmental change and care. So these are the three cases that I'm going to highlight. I will spend just a few minutes on each. I'm going to spend more time on the first one in Ladakh, India, because I'm just back from there. This spring I spent 3 weeks in India doing some research with partners there who are working on water security in Ladakh, India. And so I'll spend a little bit more time on that one. And then I'll talk a little, so that's over here. You can see the kind of general idea of the landscape in Ladakh, which is very different from this one. And then I'll talk about Fairborn Wales in the United Kingdom, which is more of a coastal situation. And then finally I'll talk about Bangun Samuchin, which is near Bangkok in Thailand, which is a coastal erosion situation. And each of these are different in their contexts. But what I want you to maybe think about is the challenges that people are facing and how they're being responded to, and maybe we can pick apart some of the care practices that we're looking at for these. So I'm going to start with the Ladakh, India project, and I put the partner funders on here because it's important to me. All of this research that I do is often funded through the humanities and the arts. I don't usually get funding and support through the sciences. It's arts and community led, and the resources that I have access to usually are arts funders. So I always work with artists and community organizations and to look at these questions, which are about the science of climate change and so on. But I think it's interesting to, when we look at these challenges through the lens of art and creative practices, might we ask different questions, or might we come up with different solutions and engage people in different ways? So I think that's, for me, that's quite important. So we wanted to look at this one about simply how is water security, how are people adapting to a changing environment in this area? So I'll skip over that because I kind of said all that. Quickly, I worked with an arts and media organization in here. So this is a community organization that actually leads this work. So really, the work I'm going to show you is their work that I've helped support, but they really designed it, and I have been lucky enough to participate in it. And that is my model. Unfortunately, it can be hard to explain, but it really is their work that I'm reporting on, and I have helped it along in ways, but it really is collaborative. We also worked in this particular project with a science organization that looks at climate change, and then schools and communities in Ladakh that have been participating. So I want to give you a little background on Ladakh because it's so far away from here in so many ways. It's the other side of the earth. But it's really, and physically it looks, environmentally it looks so different. But it's in the northern part of India. It borders Pakistan and China. And until recently, it was part of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So it was part of this area of Kashmir, which is an area of intense conflict and oppression. We're doing different work there. And it's been separated out. It's become its own territory. So you can see here, the Ladakh borders China. And you can see all these dotted lines around here as well. The borders between these countries are always contested and are never really that secure. There are areas, actually, on many maps where the lines will stop. They say, we have no idea where the border is here, just the lines stop. So all of these are contested borders. But anyhow, it is in the northern part of India, and it is in the Himalaya range. And I'll show you a couple of further images and so on. This is the main city of Leh, where we work. The organization Lama is in this building here. That's the palace in Leh. Really beautiful, amazing landscape. It's just being here in the thick of the jungle and the wet and the rain and the clouds. It just looks, it's amazing how different it is. So it barely rains there. It doesn't really snow that much there. It's very, very dry. You will get snow up in the mountains, but the place gets very little precipitation. When it does, it comes in the winter. They call it a high altitude desert, so it's very cold. It can be minus 40 at some point Celsius, and it's very high up. The mountains go up to 25, 30, almost 30,000 feet in this area. People live very traditional lifestyles in much of the rural part. There used to be many nomads who would travel across Ladakh. There's only a few thousand remaining because of changing environment and changing lifestyles. That has been kind of eliminated in many ways. But there's still quite a rural community here who involved with agriculture and so on. Other more modern industries have come along in recent times to change the community. And in terms of water and water security, Ladakh relies on its glaciers for its water security. There are some 20,000 glaciers in Ladakh, in this region. They're all mostly very, very small, so they're not the massive glaciers that you see kind of crumbling in different parts of the world and so on. They're usually quite small, but they're very, very high up, so they're at very high altitude. And what happens is each year it snows in this area and more ice forms, and they get a little bit bigger. And in the springtime, that melts. That melts and provides people with their drinking water. So that will come in the springtime. It's really important, that water, because that's when they need to irrigate their crops. So it's this springtime melt which is really important. And it's the springtime melt which is missing. With less snow, they're not getting that springtime melt. So the water security, that little gap, the gap in water security, is before the big glaciers are actually melting. It's the new snowfall, which isn't falling, and the newly created ice isn't melting that's causing this gap. Of course, these glaciers are part of this, what they call this area the third pole, because there's so much clean water in the Himalayan mountains. And it provides water security to some billion people, be part of these glaciers and others. Incredibly important water landscape for not only the people of Ladakh, but for Asia. Those glaciers, studies have shown how they are retreating, they're becoming more threatened and so on. So this is a little bit about what we do. These are a couple of examples of working with students about how they look at themselves and the environment. We ask them to explore their village, explore their water resources, to look at the ways in which water makes up their lives and so on. So we go on water walks and they do drawings and so on. And you can see, the kinds of ideas about looking about the ideas of agriculture and water, but also the village stream and so on. So they're able to express their connection to water and how water provides for those flourishing lives. The people of Ladakh are so tuned into their environments. It's really amazing. It is a spiritual connection, which I'll talk about. In the third bullet, I talk about the rituals and stories. Each mountain, each community has a main mountain peak that is its sort of protector, and there's a deity in this mountain that they provide, or they will give rituals to and pray to and so on. So these are protector deities. The glaciers have stories and songs about them. So the environment and the mountains are in the spirituality and culture of the people, who then use that as a way of communing and engaging with their water and with their life. What's interesting also to me is they're a formerly very traditional society with traditional water techniques that are now getting more modern water, like piped water is being introduced in different areas, but it never works completely right. So you'll see that they will have a mix of traditional water supply and modern water supply that happens in different, we use this word hybridity to talk about that sort of mix. Here's an example of kind of the cultural practice of Ladakh and how the environment is expressed in that. So when we were there recently, the children and community would gave a presentation about the environment to us that they had been exploring and talking about their stories and songs. So they were singing a song about glaciers. So there's a book full of folklore and songs about water, that are historical songs. So there's a book full of these. So one of these, this is the sort of the folklore. If the glacier does not form, why should the turquoise lake form? So in their culture, there's always these expressions of these songs about recognizing their place in the environment. So beautiful songs and dress and experience and rituals around water and water security. So it's water and the environment is cultural. So what I'd like to highlight here in a couple of slides before I move on to the next case is just what does water infrastructure look like in Ladakh. The one on the top right is basically a pond. So if it rains so little, what has to happen is they want to hold that water. In this case, they hold the snow in these ponds, and it collects and it freezes, and then they keep it there, and that helps to cover that gap in the early spring when they need that irrigation. This is a fascinating one. This is called an artificial glacier. So along this sort of stream bed, they have different barriers which they've built out of stone, which when it snows and the ice forms, it holds it there. So again, they're holding the snow in place, simply keeping it there while it freezes so it doesn't go away. And this is what happens what it looks like when it freezes. And then they have access to that. So very simple techniques, again, that allow them to adapt to the changing to their environment and to work with the resources that they have. These are two of the most fascinating ones. I'll talk about this one first. This is an ice wall. So the community pumps water up to the top of this hill and lets it freeze. And so this is done in the middle of the winter, so it's incredibly difficult work, pumping water up in sub-zero weather, and then it freezes, and they create this, and this ice will stay here and be used for water security. This particular one was, I think, less than successful in this particular instance, but has become a popular tourist site. So now people come and climb it. So they have ice climbing competitions on that wall every year now. This one here is called an ice stupa, and you may recognize that design. It's like a Buddhist, it's almost like a Buddhist temple. They call these stupas. So this is an ice stupa. So they pump water up into the air from the ground, and they let that freeze. And again, this is an artificial glacier that they've created that then melts at the right time. So they're using these very simple techniques that are very cultural. They're connected to their ideas about the environment that then allow them to adapt to that water security. Interestingly, from all of these activities are organized at the community level. So you see people engaging through the community and through collective action to build and maintain and look after these infrastructures. So with that, I think I want to give you a diversity of views of different places where climate change and water and air and infrastructure are being happening. So I finished with Ladakh, and I want to move quickly to Wales. So this is a place called Fairborn. Now, how does that look? Right? How would you like to live there? Look at that. That's on the coast. There's mountains. Right? So this is a community that is right at the edge of the coast. It looks beautiful. I showed it very quickly. If you're familiar with the United Kingdom, it's in Wales. This is the Irish Sea, so it's on the coast in an area. It's generally rural, but has a few villages, so it's a small village. So it's a small village on the coast. You can see it's right there. It's not that many people. It's a small community. Maybe there's 1,000, 1,200 people. This is all sand down in here. So it was as the sand moves along, it creates this sort of sandbar. It's basically built out of sandbar. So we have the bay, we have a river, and we have a mountain, and we have Fairborn built in between. Most of the people who live there, many of the people have sold. They lived in Liverpool or Birmingham, and they wanted to live on the coast. They sold their home and bought a house on the coast. They're going to retire here. There's many retirees here, so they just moved there to enjoy the coast and the beautiful beach. And so that's a little bit what it looks like. So, this is not that area, but I wanted to show this image because it shows how much this area changes. This is a castle in Wales, in this part of Wales. And what do you know about castles is normally they're built on the water. They're built as in defensible areas. So that you used to be able to access this castle by boat. So obviously you can barely even see the sea. So this area of the world, the coast is always changing. The coast is not static. The coast is always changing. And this is, for me, was a really powerful example of, wow, it's going in all different directions. So where there's gain in one area, there may be loss in another. So this is a really dynamic coastal area. So recognizing that, the government of the United Kingdom has been planning for coasts. They recognize that sea level rise is happening. They recognize that these are dynamic areas. And they did some planning to see about which areas are under danger and so on. So, anyhow, Fairborn, you can see it's back here, and it's protected by this seawall and this huge beach. The beach ends here. The houses are actually down here. That's how low they are. So they have been protected by this amazing bit of infrastructure that is holding keeping the water back. That allows those places to be there. Now you can see these are some of the tops of the houses. You can see they don't even go over. Now, if that infrastructure wasn't there, the place would flood immediately, be gone. But since it's there, it's protected. It doesn't flood. It doesn't generally flood. It's dry. It's safe. People there are not flooded every day. Every once in a while there'll be an area that gets wet, but it's protected. Now, with the planning, they looked at what would happen with sea level rise. They're taking sea level rise into consideration, and they've said, well, if we have a meter of sea level rise, this village is going to be gone in 60 years. If we have 2 meters of sea level rise, it's going to be lost in 40 years. They said, this place is in danger. So they decided, engineers and planners decided that we should abandon this place because it's too dangerous. in many ways, that is a rational approach towards looking at the coast. This place will not last through climate change and sea level rise. Let's move it. Let's get rid of it. Okay. Unfortunately, the people in the community did not know about that. So it was. So actually, people learned. They turned on the television, and on the news, it said Fairborn, Wales, to be abandoned in 10 years. Was how the news reported it. They got the year wrong. Maybe they just did that to be more exciting. So can you imagine if you were told your community was going to be from never floods? You retired there. It's safe. It's a beautiful place. And then all of a sudden on the news, it's gone in 10 years. So this caused obviously panic and so on. It turns out they're not going to abandon it in 10 years, but 40 years. So it will be abandoned. There's no plan to resettle these people. There's no plan to compensate them for their loss. Now I find this really fascinating because here you have the government proactively thinking about climate change, which is what we want governments to do. Where are the vulnerable, dangerous, fragile places on the coast? But then completely failing to think about the impact on people, their emotions, their lives, their investments, and just simply calling it an engineering reality. Now, of course, we know there is no engineering reality, it's all politics. The City of London is in just the same danger, but will always be protected. We have the Thames Barrage, which keeps flooding out and so on, and there'll be more protections built there. Places like New York City will always be protected as much as they can possibly protect them. Places like Wales, these more vulnerable places without the political clout, without the importance and value, are the ones that are being impacted immediately by climate change. So while I think it's amazing to look at the sea and climate change and sea level rise, there's something really wrong with when we just simply say this place has no value. This is clearly the case in Fairborn. Now, Fairborn, what they wound up doing is trying to resist that. They've created community organizations, they've sued the government, they've enlisted universities, and so on to try and change that outcome. No success, unfortunately. So the place is really just deteriorating in front of our eyes. Can you imagine? It's just who would buy a house in Fairborn now? How could you move? How could you sell it when it's to be abandoned? So that is a bit catastrophic. Now, from one catastrophe to the next. This one is a case I look at in terms of coastal erosion, more specifically. The other one is interesting because it's on the coast, but it's not eroding, but they're planning for it. Here's one where it's eroding, but there's no planning. There's absolutely no look at the coast, but it's just eroding right, literally in front of our eyes. So I'll talk a little bit about this. The first thing I want to mention, though, is this was one of these. One of the projects that I designed to bring science and arts together. We had Jay Coe, my friend Jay Coe, who's an artist, who's a celebrated artist, and then we had Dr. Bidorn, who was an engineer from Thailand. Now, unfortunately, these two people hated each other so much. They actually yelled at each other on the Zoom calls we were having. It was difficult. It was so difficult. So this is what happens in my work, is sometimes we have amazing successes, but sometimes people clash. So the clashes here, they actually limited what I could get out of and what we could do with the project. So I actually don't work in Bangkok any longer because it was just too difficult, and it just kind of said, okay, that didn't work. Nevertheless, we did learn a lot. I learned a lot about that. So in Asia, we know there's a tremendous amount of coastal erosion and flooding, and the coast, because of climate change, we're seeing a significant amount of coastal change. Bangkok is actually is getting lower, right? It's sinking because not only of sea level rise, but because of groundwater extraction, the ground is sinking. This is a place in Bali that I visited. There used to be houses on this side as well. So these are examples. You can see this is the dynamic coast. And in Asia, in this part of Asia, it is changing rapidly. And climate change is contributing to that. This is my case. This is a village I'm looking at called Bangkok Samuchin, which is south. Bangkok is towards the top. And then this is in the Gulf of Thailand. At the edge of, again, you can see the fragility, the vulnerability here. it's right on the edge of the Gulf, the river, and all this sort of area. So there'll be storms that come up through the Gulf, floods that come out, and so on. So again, another challenging area. This is what it looks like. This is land. This is actually land. This is the village. It's not amazing. So you talk about living with water. This is it. So on the other side of this is another. This is the shrimp farm, and on the other side there'll be another aquaculture area. So you get around on these small paths. To get to this community, we got on a boat 10 miles up and kind of meandered our way through canals and so on, and then got off at a dock and walked along these paths another 15 minutes to get to the village. Incredible isolation. And the water is everywhere. So everywhere. So you're living with water in this really amazing way. Now, this is what's happening. I'm actually going to skip one forward because this is more dramatic in the next dimension. That little temple I showed you in the 1970s was well on land. This is where there's a temple right here, well back, quarter of a kilometer, right? And then you can see it's on the coast, and you see in 2010 or so, it's way out there. Right? This is all water, surrounded by water. Okay? So that's coastal erosion. That's Asian coastal erosion, right? In 30, 40 years, it's gone back, almost a kilometer, right? So it is changing dramatically, this landscape. Now, why is that happening? It's not really only sea level rise and storms. Storms are doing it, but what's happening is this is all aquaculture. So you can see that shrimp farm. So once that one area opens, if that's destroyed, the water goes through the whole farm. So the farming actually it stimulates even further erosion. So all of a sudden it goes back really. So one night you could lose 30 yards or something of land through this process. So the coasts are changing so much that people are having to move several times. I just go back, sorry, to this one. This is how you get to the temple. Now, how is the temple still there? The temple, as a Buddhist temple, gets philanthropic donations from locals as well as the country in Thailand and internationally as this, it's sort of like a symbol of resistance and resilience. It says, we're still here. In fact, they were building a new building when I was there. They were up there building more buildings on this place. This place isn't going anywhere. It's got fortress around it. They have built concrete pylons and pillars and everything to protect it. Meanwhile, the village has no funds to protect itself, and so people are moving back annually each year because of the coastal erosion. So when we were there, we've talked to a few people. The village head man, who's basically the mayor or so, he presents the case. He actually showed me a letter he wrote to Al Gore. So Al Gore, please help us. So they're looking for help, these kinds of places, for funds to build walls. Right? The government in Thailand, in Bangkok, does nothing. Okay, leaves them alone. So without those resources, the people have to fend for themselves. So I'll give you a quick example of what people are doing there. So I've mentioned this, many people have moved many times. So here's a couple examples of what they're doing. So these are things that the residents, some of the universities, they do get some donations every now and again. So they're building rock walls to protect their village. They're replanting the mangroves. Really the problem is they've ripped out all the mangroves for farming. So they're now reintroducing mangroves all across this coast, this area. They're building bamboo, wave breaks, and so on. So the community is actively working to reclaim these areas that have lost. It's really fascinating. This was actually underwater a few years ago, this area. And they slowly planted mangroves and protected them with some walls, and they reclaimed that land. So they're actually they want them back, actually. They're not really, actually, fascinatingly, they don't want to just stay where they are. They want to get back to where they were. So you see them actually trying to reclaim land. And there are maps that show actually how the land is being reclaimed through mangrove forests and forestation. Now, these are led, again, I mentioned by residents. So there's a community steward who looks after these mangroves. The local knowledge about what to plant, when to plant them, how to protect them is really amazing. You can actually go to Thailand and you can plant a mangrove in the coast as a kind of like a, hey, I've done my part for the world. and save the coast. But normally they just die. They took us to all these different mangrove forests that were dead because they had no, you put a baby mangrove in the water without the right protections, or you put the wrong species there, and it's not going to last. So the local people showed me that they have done this, they practiced this over time, so they had this local knowledge about which species to plant and how to protect them and so on. And they've been more or less, some successful. That said, this is a vulnerable area that is limited, receives little support from the wider world, and is left to many of its own devices to try and protect its area. So I asked you at the beginning to think about how the environment is changing here, and how maybe you've been inspired to think about some of the ways it's been changing elsewhere. So I'd like you maybe to call on you to maybe think about that. I've also wanted maybe to identify some of the care practices around working with the environment. I'll highlight just a few that I take out of some of those cases, and then we can have a little discussion. First of all, I see in those cases fragility through and through. Vulnerability and fragility. People are living in very precarious situations. They really draw attention to how fragile we are in those cases. I think we are in everywhere. The people in Manhattan, the people in London are just as fragile. They're just not aware of it, right? They've been protected by modern infrastructure, which kind of makes it difficult for us to see that fragility. We don't like it, right? But here we can obviously see it. So in that sense, I think when we provide water security, whether that be drinking water, protection from floods, and so on, that's care work. To give water security is care work, and I see that that's what these people are doing in these areas. I see a huge area, collectivity. Care is about giving, isn't it? There's a reciprocity there, but often we give care and we don't get it back immediately, or we get it back from someone else in a different way. And that's what's happening in these cases. Is there's care for infrastructure or care for the environment that maybe we benefit directly, or maybe we don't, maybe there's indirect benefits, right? So we see that collectivity in what's happening in a lot of these cases that I've looked at. So I think I use this idea of ecology of care. So I think that anytime we provide a care practice, it's never done alone, right? It's done, if I provide water security, there could be a stone wall that's helping me. So there could be some element in the environment. There could be, another person that's with me. The water itself. This is an ecology. This is a network of things that actually help us to realize water security. So we don't do it on our own. And the more my sort of goal is to expose that ecology more. Not only in these very fragile environments, but in the more so-called secure ones, like London or Bristol, or places where you don't see this infrastructure. But I see these care practices as being just as important in those areas as well. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts on my analysis of what's happening there and what you've experienced here. So I think with that, that's my end. Yes. Two lovely pictures from recently visited Ladakh. There's the city of Leh, absolutely amazing. And this is where the Indus joins another river in Ladakh. Look at that amazing landscape, right? So really beautiful territory. So I just felt so special to be there. Anyhow, thank you very much. Thank you. That's it. Boring, it's a little warm and hot, but I am really interested in hearing if you have questions about any of the cases, or just your thoughts on the questions that I posed as well. It'd be really great to hear.
Do you think that these measures like the artificial glaciers and the reclaiming will be enough to keep this going, or will eventually that not be enough?
That's a tough one. I'm a big believer in the return to these traditional approaches to water security. So in India, it has an ancient history of rainwater harvesting, traditional methods of water security. People lived in this area, and in Rajasthan, in the deserts, is another area we've worked with almost no water, and they flourished, and cities were built, and so on. So it's possible to live with very little using small-scale It's probably not, only because there's so many other forces at play. So I think it's going to be probably need to be a mix of different approaches. So I use this idea of hybridity. I think we need the traditional, the small scale, artificial glaciers and the simple, but we also are going to need more coordinated approaches. The problem with the two cases, Ladakh and Thailand, is that there's no coordination. It's just everyone's doing it for themselves, and that's probably not going to be sufficient, I think.
And do you see like traditional methods being transferred from one region to the other? For example, people who are living more in the desert transferring this to people who are getting less water now?
Yeah, it's interestingly, they don't, I've worked in two places that use similar methods of traditional water security, rainwater harvesting. They don't talk. It's weird. So I think there should be more exchange. There must be more out there, but limited for some reason. And Ladakh is an extremely isolated place, so that may be part of it. One thing we want to do is encourage more exchange, do a network, and so on. The artificial glaciers became really popular. They were in the news. You can find articles on them in all international media. And they had a competition. So all through Ladakh, a couple of years ago, they were everywhere. Actually, now they're gone because they're so difficult to build, and they're not 100% sure how well I'm speaking of the ice tulas in particular, how well they actually work. So they're still studying the effectiveness and so on. But they've kind of fallen out of favor a little bit already. But I think it's going to need to be a mix. Yeah. Thank you for that.
I was just, comparing like the cases you have studied. It makes me think a lot about planning and the resources you normally have in developed countries versus developing nations. Because it seems that the case in Europe, in particular England, this community have already done the studies, which we lack of in most developing nations. We lack of planning tools and strategies and resources to do that. And it also makes me think how communities organize themselves, connecting more like, the theory of care to the concept of community itself. Because when you don't necessarily have the resources, people rely initially, right, to respond to whatever situation is happening, whether this is climate change or any other crisis.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting to compare those particular situations. And I mean, it's not going to change anytime soon. I mean, the situation, whether it's in India or it's in China, it's tough to get to where most developed nations are in terms of planning. So many steps ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree completely. We need to understand the environment better. We need to be planning more collaboratively. We were talking all day today about different needs, like for this area as well, thinking about planning and understanding the environment. I'm terrified of planning, actually, in many ways, because when we exclusively use science to make decisions, we do terrible. It shouldn't be there. Place should not be there. It's in the wrong. I mean, come on. What were they thinking? It was built before we had this sense of climate change, and it was a beautiful spot. It shouldn't be there. But you can't simply say we've done the engineering and it says it can't. It doesn't. So I'm always nervous about using planning and engineering techniques exclusively and letting them be the lead. We have to bring people along. The other thing you mentioned made me think of the inequality of inequality across communities. There are some communities that can organize, and if you give everyone local responsibility, some will do really well. They have social capital, they have resources. Some will not. Some will fail because they have different sets of resources. So just giving everything to the locals isn't the answer either. So I think I agree with everything you said. These are incredible challenges. I suppose we need some kind of mix. We need to keep communities involved when we're doing any kind of planning about the environment and about environmental change, I think. Was there another question?
In India, I think where the glaciers are they thinking about, or are they worried about the extensions of the glaciers that they're experiencing?
Yeah, so they know the glaciers are retreating. The only problem they feel so far is that that first irrigation. Other than that, their water security is relatively unchanged. Where they see it is in the environment is changing more broadly. So it becomes more difficult to lead some of the traditional lifestyles, like nomads and so on. Their lives have changed significantly, so there's fewer of them. And they recognize that that this is changing, but there's very little. So the government in India is trying to give every household piped water. So that's an objective of the current government in India. Every household can have water at the store. So actually, if you go to these villages, they'll have a modern water pump and it comes to the house. And it works, half the year maybe. So that's the kind of condition that they're working in. So they're going to rely on this. So they recognize the world is changing, the environment is changing, and that's why we have these kinds of techniques, I think, emerging. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting and important the way you talk about care. And I know that for a lot of us over the top of the mountain, one of the things that I think speaks to us is that we're here at a source. And if we don't care about what happens to the water here, it carries all the way down the mountain. And I think that speaks to people here in a way that maybe if we just talked about technology or cleaning the water, it might not. So that sense of care and us realizing that is we have to care from the top of the mountain because it affects everybody going down.
Yeah, and what interests me is, okay, we have that here, and we can all agree that we have that. So how do we make that universal? Why is it, this is a very progressive, interesting, amazing place. So what about other watershed communities? How can we make sure that's passed? I mean, there's so many rivers and streams and places around the world where we don't have that, where we're polluting in our area and sending it downstream, and there's conflicts and so on about that. So we need to make that more visible. That's really where I'm interested in, is how do we make that connection between what we're doing here actually relates to what's happening further on? How do we care about what we're doing with that? So yeah, I agree 100%. So how do we translate that elsewhere is a big challenge, I think. So if you have an answer, that would be great. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, so I've got a question about the community. It seems like a lot of the infrastructure that they're building has to do with slowing the rate of melt or just having it slowly trickle. But then in the other parts of the year, you have rivers flowing, right, from the glacial melt. Is there additional infrastructure to catch the main source of water that's coming later in the year?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I asked that question several times and never got a really good answer. The Indus is right there. I mean, the Indus is flowing by these communities. I walked over it on bridges and stuff. They don't drink it. They don't use it. Mostly, it's. I couldn't actually get a really good answer to why they're not tapping into some of those sources up here. But the one answer that I got, which I still not believe is the only answer, is the expense, because they can't pump it. There's no money to pump the water out. To get it from there up to the village or to where they need it is too expensive. They just simply don't have that resource to pay for that. So the village couldn't pump the water up from where it is to where they need it. So they use gravity. Yeah. But I'm not completely convinced that it's a huge river right there that it does actually feed other people. Drinking water security further down. They don't use it.
Well, maybe it has to do with politics and economic interests.
Could be.
Here happens a lot.
I don't know. There are loads of treaties on the Indus as well. I can't imagine a little village in the middle of a dock accessing the Indus would be a problem. But obviously, that river goes through Pakistan and have all kinds of treaties about how much water you can access. But they're building hydroelectric dams and all sorts of things along it. So I can't imagine that that's the issue either. But there's probably politics as well. Maybe there's inertia. Maybe it's just this is the way we always have done it. And maybe someone needs to just go out there and do it. Any other thoughts?
I think maybe, I'm not sure if it's a question itself, but with this idea of the water wars at the beginning, I was reading an author that was saying that that was not going to happen, that throughout history there's been more efforts, people joining together to help water situation rather than creating water out of it. developing care could be sort of like a solution to this possible situation. And my question maybe is like all these communities that you've worked with, if like the efforts that they've done were like they came up from the community, or was there someone else outside making it possible?
Okay, two things there. First, about the conflict, you're absolutely right. Water war is actually not real so much. People say it's not really likely to happen. But there is an organization, I forgot what they're called, I do have notes I can send it to you if you like. They monitor conflict around water. And what happens is normally around conflict, water, there may be conflict, and the water security is diminished in that case often. So if you have a situation where there's violence or war or so on, water security suffers. So often you see it because of conflict on other issues. Water security is impacted. So that's happening quite a lot. They have maps that show all these different areas. There are also every once in a while conflicts around water. They don't usually wind up in war, but I mean, look, Los Angeles, the Los Angeles aqueduct. There was people blew it up at the beginning. There were deaths, there were murders around that. So it's not unprecedented. It does happen, but yeah, it's not quite as dire as that. The second question was
like if the solutions or all these like efforts were like came up from.
Oh, right. Yeah, it's interesting. It's usually it's hard to make a universal about that. They come from different areas. Often in the places I worked, there's an NGO advocating traditional water management techniques that is trying to push that. In India specifically, there's an ancient history of working with water in a very spiritual way. You may be familiar with the step wells. They used to build these amazing step wells that you would walk down into and collect the water, and they're designed with beautiful architecture and sculptures and so on. So they really celebrated the water, but that's all lost. That was gone. With modern development, they decided they didn't need that anymore, and they brought in canals and pipes, all of which mostly failed. So NGOs are often trying to rebuild that ancient knowledge about water and water management. They have to basically rebuild the knowledge base. So I see it as local, often community driven, but with support. But that's just one example I can think of. I think it comes from many, many different ways. Yeah.
Just in terms of trying to apply this to here.
Yeah.
Someone local, we've been having water conversations here from sure Fernand's told you, and we're recognizing the real limitations of water here, and I had a neighbor ask me, well, because one of the questions in our meetings was, well, can we store this this excess of water that we have? And the answer was no, it won't be drinkable if we store it, But a neighbor after the meeting was asking me, well, in a lot of other places in the world they have these reservoirs where they store water, and they dam it up or whatever, and then they use it, they treat it, and then they use it, and is that not an option here? And I really didn't have an answer. There may be a really obvious one.
I mean, there would be a lot of experts here actually can talk about that. I don't see why that's the answer to that question is no.
Obviously, a location issue. Where would you put those? But
I mean,
that's always controversial.
My colleague Kathleen is working with water storage in other parts of this, not this up here in the mountain, but in the region,
Yeah.
and they're storing it, and so. I don't think the answer is just a clear-cut no. That seems like an unusual answer to me. People across the world, I just looked at an island with no drinking water that is storing rainwater, an hour or two from here, in big giant 5,000 liter storage tanks.
Mm-hmm.
So unless there's something unusual about being at the top of a mountain, which I can't imagine, I think it certainly should be an option. And other places, the place where I work, collect the rainwater, goes through a couple of filters, and they store it. They collect it in India, they collect it during the monsoon season, so they can have it 6 months later, 8 months later. So it's definitely possible, unless there's something environmentally unusual about
I'm
the rain.
sure there would be economic issues around it.
But it's not that expensive, not at all. I can assure
what we see also in many of the cases that Catalina's been involved in and that I have seen is that community, often maybe you get a grant for the equipment, and then the community goes out and puts it up, finishes it, builds it, you save some expenses that way. Also, that helps the community understand, oh, look at this infrastructure, now we know how to maintain it, now we know what it's doing, it's part of our community. So obviously being involved in the creation of these systems is really important as well. Yeah, I encourage you to keep that conversation going and don't just take no for an answer. Because I can't imagine that that's a clear cut. Yeah, that seems suspicious to me. Yeah. Yes?
Do you have any advice for university students who are like interested in getting more involved in like community engagement or like potentially pursuing this as like a career?
Goodness. Any advice? Well, obviously you're here, so you've obviously, I mean, this is to being involved in these issues. I mean, just get yourself involved, volunteer or obviously everyone's journey is a different journey. I was able to use the university as a way to do this stuff. The university comes with a lot of limitations. So it wants you to write papers, teach courses, and do this sort of stuff. It won't let me do things a lot, like actually build stuff. I can't get access to that. Amazingly, Catalina and her university has been able to do that. So it's really trying to maybe straddle the line between what an academic or a student might be able to do and what a nonprofit might do or government might do. I think Catalina's model is absolutely amazing and really inspiring. So maybe talk to her a bit more about that. But I mean, being here is obviously you're going to learn and experience and so on. Yeah, it's a terrible answer, but I don't know if I'm involved. So yeah. I don't think academia is really the right place to make change always. I have some interesting ideas. I think ecologies there sounds good. But people who are really out there doing stuff are the communities themselves. So if you really want to make change, you've probably got to get embedded in place and stay there and really, really make change. And, you know, I've just given you a whirlwind tour of 3 places. I've probably been in 5, 6 places. That's too much, isn't it? That's terrible. You know, you've got to think about legacy, think about really embedding yourself in a place if you really want to make change. My objectives are a little bit different. I want to see the world in what's happening in water and climate change and care, rather than in one spot. That's my particular objective. So I'm not going to have as much impact. I won't. I admit that, sorry.
Your impact is to teach.
My impact is different, exactly. Catalina's got a different set of impacts, which are more precise and people's lives are changing more directly. Shall we end there? Is there another question? It was really amazing to meet you. I've learned so much today from my time in Costa Rica so far. Oh, there's another question.
No, era más una intervención porque cuando en el conversatorio pues si podíamos almacenar agua desde el universal. Yo dije no, porque no podemos poner un tanque, dejarlo un año ahí, después vamos a quemarlo. Lo que dije fue que desconocíamos si en Costa Rica existía alguna tecnología o algo similar. Por lo menos nosotros, que venía con el protector, nunca hemos hablado de alguna tecnología que podamos utilizar. Sería buenísimo si existiera algo. Pero la respuesta era no.